subtle state of concentration. These Indians, and of course this is the basis still now of Buddhist psychology, the model of the mind as presented in Buddhism, they mapped the mind, but they mapped it internally. This is a big surprise to us. We don't have techniques like this at all. We need a microscope and a physical thing to look at. For the Buddha, these previous Indians, it's internal. And I think in our culture we don't trust the internal. We don't trust what we call emotions and feelings. We think they're not kind of rigorous. Not the way the Buddha thinks. So if you study the Buddhist mind, the Buddhist model of the mind in depth, it's astonishing the depth and clarity in the literature over the centuries. It goes to incredible depth, and it's utterly necessary for a person who's a serious Buddhist to really comprehend the theoretical presentation of what consciousness is and how it functions. Why? Because that's the central job of being a Buddhist. Ridding the mind of all the rubbish and developing all the goodness, which is internal. It's internal. So these words, like mind, compassion, hate, we know these words, but we have definitions of them and crucially understandings of the causes of them that are so different, it's quite hard to hear what Buddha is saying. So like I said, for the Buddha, it's not a joke to say that the mind is his expertise. And he's saying that what goes on in our mind is the source, the main source. Well, he'd actually say the main source of the universe. That sounds like a joke, but I'm not going to talk about it. But crucially, the main source of our happiness and suffering. Now this is itself quite shocking already. Because if Panos is unkind to me and I'm crying, what's wrong, Robina? And I'll give a detailed description of Panos's action. You won't be surprised. You won't say, well, that's no reason to think he's no reason to be unmiserable just because he punched you. We'd be shocked to say that. We assume. Our assumption's so deep, and this is the assumption of dogs and rats and monkeys as well. It's deep in the bones, Buddha says, of sentient beings' minds. And he says it's a mistake. Panos's action of unkindness is not the main cause of my suffering. But as far as our world is concerned, our models of the mind, science, and don't hear this in any punitive kind of way, it's really quite a subtle point. And we can prove we understand it by our actions every day, but we don't really think it through. Because it's so spontaneous for us to think that out there is the source of my happiness and out there is the source of my suffering. And don't hear it as religious and punitive. Oh, you shouldn't like chocolate cake. You've got to learn to be happy on your own. Don't hear it like that. It's a technical point that Buddha's making. But because we can't hear it properly, that indicates, it's quite subtle, it indicates how opposite we are, Because the default mode of all of us is just the natural assumption we have is, people's words, the taste of the cake, the weather, the feelings in the body, the actions of the Catholic nuns when I was at school, the actions of my mummy and daddy when I was a kid, that they are the source. And it's proved because when we go, one of you's a therapist, you kind of work out why I get angry and why I keep choosing crummy boyfriends like Panos. You've got to look back into the past, like a needle in a haystack, aren't we? We all look in the past. It's natural in us, utterly spontaneous. We look back in the past for this, to see what happened, why I'm angry, why I'm jealous, why I get into the habit of crummy relationships. The Buddha would say there's something wrong with that, but he says we're not looking at the main thing. But we've got to look at the mind. I'm going to go into this. So let's just quickly look at at the Buddha's view about what the mind is and what the mind is not, just to sort of get ourselves clear when we use this word. At least we can take Buddha's deal about it, because I'm going to be discussing his views, right? Well, first, it's not your brain. It's not physical. So straight away we say that, we seem to think, oh, well, that's called a spirit or a soul. No, he doesn't use those words. He uses the same word, mind. But there are subtler levels of it, that's all. Second point, your mind, well, it's already indicated, goes to these subtler levels, which we need eventually to unpack and unravel, utilising this technique in order to do the job of ridding it of all the rubbish and growing all the goodness. Meditation itself is not the point. It's just a technique that you use to hone your mind to do the real job. The real job, as Lama Yeshe puts it, of being your own therapist. To become intimately familiar with the contents of your own mind. The next thing about the mind, this is quite shocking, contrary to the materialist view and contrary to all the creative views, we are not the handiwork of another person. This is almost quite shocking for us. Your mother and father did not make you. They gave you a body. Nobody can argue. That's evident to eyes. That's clear. Your body comes from mummy and daddy. But not your anger, and not your kindness, and not your psychosis, and not your love, and not your compassion, and not your being good at football or good at music. These are mental tendencies that are our own, Buddha says. This is the most fundamental point in Buddhism. That when we can begin to even theoretically take this on board, the implication of this for practice is where we get it, the penny drops, you know. Our mind is our own. So it's obvious if we didn't therefore begin in our mother's womb, or whenever the Catholics say, I remember I was talking about abortion, some people say, the Catholics say that you start at 40 weeks or something, that God puts the soul in there at about 40 weeks. There's different views, isn't there? But from the Buddhist point of view, it's very clear. The egg and sperm of your mummy and daddy go into the womb. Well, these days it's more complicated. They go into petri dishes and things, don't they? But it's all based on the old-fashioned way of getting born, okay? The teachings, so that's very interesting. Got to come up with new ideas when it comes to eggs and sperm. Comes to petri dishes. So, as far as Buddha is concerned, conception, which is when the egg and sperm come together, what causes it to become the body of you is the entry of your consciousness. From where? Well, clearly from before. So this is where the business of reincarnation. It's not just some hippie idea. People think hippies made it up. I'm joking, you know. It's just, these Indians way back, you know. So it's several thousand years old, this view of reincarnation, coming from a very sophisticated presentation. And the Buddha's clearly the same. That our consciousness doesn't begin in the mother's womb. It's got its own continuity and goes back and back and back. And indeed, when we die, it'll go forward, forward, forward. So we're going to go into this. This implies all this business about karma, which again is not some hippie idea, it's not some random stuff. It's very broadly and deeply taught, you know, in the literature, the explanations. This is, as far as Buddha is concerned, it's a way of presenting how the world is, why they're suffering, why happiness, why this, why that. Karma. So your consciousness is not the product of your mummy and daddy. It's not the result of, you're not the handiwork of a creator. There's no creator as far as Buddha is concerned. He has the word superior being. If you hear the actual qualities of a being who has accomplished Buddhahood, it could sound like the qualities of God. There's many similarities, you can see this. But the crucial difference in Buddhism, fundamental, is that there's a superior being. Buddha uses that term, Arya being in Sanskrit, is not the source of anybody else. We are the source of ourself. This is a sort of a shocking point. Because experientially we don't think so. We think, oh, I didn't ask to get born. We feel like a victim of somebody else. This is very deep, the way we think about ego. We'll go into this. As far as Buddha is concerned, we are the fruit of our own past. Quite literally. Literally the fruit of our own past. So this consciousness goes to far more subtle levels. It did not begin in your mother's womb. It goes back and back. It will not end at death. It will continue. And it's the main source. And it goes to these subtle levels. So there's many different approaches to what the mind is. And to understand Buddhism, if you read Buddhist teachings, to understand where he's coming from, and not just treat it as some kind of mystical thing that can't be proved, you have to know theoretically the meaning of the words. And all knowledge starts with theory, doesn't it? I mean, you can't suddenly sit at the kitchen table with a bunch of eggs and flour and sugar and milk and hope sort of a revelation will come about how to make a cake. People would laugh at you, you know. You have to learn the words first, learn the theories first. It's hardly surprising to us. But we like to be mystical about things. Okay, so the reason to look into our mind,